Picture a man walking into a newspaper office in the summer of 1947 in the heat-blasted stretch of California and Nevada that people call Death Valley. He says he has found something under the ground. Not a mine, not a cave, a city. Tunnels cut into rock, chambers lined with a soft yellow metal, and lying in those chambers, the dried bodies of people who, when measured, stood nearly 8 feet tall. And in the center of it all, according to the account, a coffin made of solid gold. That story really did appear. It ran in a small paper, it spread for a short while, and then it simply stopped. No expedition confirmed it, no artifact was ever put on a shelf, no photograph survives in any archive that anyone has been able to produce. It is as if the whole thing rose out of the sand for a few weeks and then sank back into it. And that leaves us with two very different possibilities sitting side by side. On one hand, there is the long, older tradition, the stories told by the people who actually lived in that valley, and the tunnel legends that run all through the folklore of the American Southwest, spoken of long before any newspaper existed. On the other hand, there is this single, strange, short-lived news event from 1947 with named men and specific claims that appeared and vanished almost overnight. The question at the heart of this is simple to ask and very hard to answer. Was the 1947 story pure fabrication, a piece of tall-tale entertainment for a hot summer, or was it a garbled, sensational echo of something real that people had spoken about in that desert for a very long time? To get anywhere near an answer, we are going to do a few things together. We will look closely at what the newspaper account actually said and who the men behind it were. We will step back into the older layer, the traditions and the tunnel stories that came long before 1947. We will examine why no institution holds any record of the find and what that silence does and does not prove. And we will look honestly at where the facts run out and where the imagination takes over. Because in a story like this, telling those two apart is the whole game. Start with the land itself, because the land is where every version of this story begins. Death Valley is the lowest, driest, hottest place on the continent. In summer, the ground temperature can climb past anything a human body can bear for long. It is a landscape of salt flats, of eroded canyons, of mountains that look scorched. And yet people have lived there, and lived well enough to leave a memory, for thousands of years. The Timbisha Shoshone are the indigenous people of that valley. Their presence there is documented and long, and their relationship with the place is not the relationship of a visitor. They know its water sources, its seasons, its safe passages. And within their tradition, as within the tradition of many peoples across the Southwest, there are stories that speak of what lies beneath, of ancestors who came before, of openings in the earth, of a world under the surface world. I want to be careful here, and honest. These are not my stories to reshape, and I will not pretend to a precision the record does not give me. But it is a matter of documented anthropology that tunnel and underworld motifs run deep and wide through the oral traditions of the region. To the people who carried them, these were not idle tales. They were part of how the world was understood, kept alive by voice across generations. If you find yourself drawn to these older layers of memory, the stories that history books tend to walk right past, then consider subscribing, because this channel is built almost entirely out of them. So here is what we are really holding as we go forward. We are going to weigh a modern, sensational newspaper claim against a much older and quieter body of tradition. We will trace where the 1947 story came from and who told it. We will test it against what we actually know about that era, about how such stories were made and sold. And we will ask the hard question the whole thing turns on, whether a wild summer headline could have been sitting on top of a real, much older idea that the desert had been keeping all along. And that means we have to look carefully at the story itself. Here is where the tale stops being ancient and becomes suddenly, specifically modern. Because the 1947 version did not come out of the mouth of an elder. It came out of a newspaper, attached to living names. The account, as it circulated, centered on two men who claimed to have been exploring in the Death Valley region. Depending on which retelling you read, they were prospectors, or amateur explorers, or something in between. And the story they told was not modest. They said they had discovered an entrance in the rock and that it opened into a network of tunnels running deep beneath the desert. Inside, they described chambers, and in those chambers, they said, were the preserved remains of a lost people. Not ordinary remains, bodies of unusual height, described in the retellings as reaching close to 8 or 9 feet, mummified, laid out with care. And around them, the details that made the story catch fire. Walls that seemed to be lined or coated with gold, strange markings, and objects that suggested a civilization no one could name. Now, I want you to notice something about how this reached the public, because it matters enormously for judging it. This was not a peer-reviewed report. It was not a museum bulletin. It was a newspaper feature in an age when newspapers, especially smaller regional ones, ran exactly this kind of story with real enthusiasm. The late 1940s were a golden age for the sensational human interest tale. Lost cities, hidden treasure, strange bones in the desert, these were the bread and butter of a certain kind of reporting, and readers loved them. So the very form the story arrived in should put us on guard from the first sentence. And there is another layer that deepens the suspicion, and it is important to lay it on the table plainly. The Death Valley Tunnel story did not appear in a vacuum. It sat downstream of an older and stranger current in early 20th century America, a whole subculture of claims about ancient underground civilizations in the West, about lost races, about giants beneath the sand. Some of these claims were tied to fringe spiritual movements of the era, groups that spoke of vanished super-civilizations and hidden peoples. Names and organizations from that world hovered around these stories. This is well documented as a cultural phenomenon, which means the 1947 tale had a ready-made template waiting for it, a set of expectations it could slot right into. So already, before we go a single step further, the skeptical reading is strong, and I am not going to hide it or soften it. A small paper, a sensational era, two men with an unverifiable claim, and a pre-existing genre of lost underground race stories that this one fits almost too neatly. That is the shape of a hoax, or at the very least of a wild exaggeration. If you were a careful investigator in 1947, this is exactly the kind of report you would have set aside. But here's where it gets harder to dismiss cleanly, and this is the detail that keeps the case from closing. Because the strange thing about the Death Valley Tunnel claim is not that it appeared. Sensational stories appeared all the time. The strange thing is what happened to it afterward. It did not get debunked in a satisfying way. It did not get followed up, argued over, and laid to rest. It simply evaporated. No triumphant expedition, no angry retraction, no museum stepping forward to say, "We investigated and there was nothing." It went quiet in a way that most hoaxes of that era did not. Look at the timeline as we can reconstruct it. The story surfaces, it spreads for a short window, and then the trail goes cold, fast. That is unusual. Most tall tales of the period left a paper trail of correction and mockery behind them, because debunking a good hoax was itself good copy. Here, we mostly have absence, and absence, as we will keep reminding ourselves, is a slippery thing. It can mean the story was too flimsy to bother chasing, or it can mean something quieter and more troubling. And notice one more thing before we move on. The story, wild as it was, did not invent its setting out of nothing. It planted itself in a landscape that already carried underground traditions, the very tunnel and underworld motifs we talked about, that the indigenous peoples of that region had spoken of for generations. So we have a modern, sensational claim landing directly on top of a much older layer of memory about openings in the earth and a people who came before. That overlap is either a coincidence or it is a clue, and that is the part I cannot walk past. So let me put the skeptic's case in its strongest form, without flinching, because that is the only fair way to do this. The 1947 Death Valley story has every classic marker of fabrication. It appeared in a popular press format built for exactly this kind of yarn. It made an extraordinary claim: 8-foot mummies, gold-lined tunnels, a solid gold coffin, the sort of claim that would, if true, be one of the most important archaeological finds in the history of the continent. And it offered, so far as anyone has been able to establish, not one verifiable piece of physical evidence. No bone that a laboratory examined, no photograph in a credible archive, no coordinates that led an expedition to the site. In archaeology, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, and here the evidence is close to non-existent. There is more against it. The 8-foot-tall figure is a giant red flag in the most literal sense, Claims of giant human skeletons run all through 19th and early 20th century American newspapers, and where those claims have been checked, they collapse. Misidentified animal bones, exaggerated measurements, outright invention. The human skeletal record simply does not support a race of people standing 8 or 9 feet tall. That is not a matter of opinion or suppression. It is a matter of biology and of everything we have actually dug up. So the mummy detail alone should make any careful person lean hard toward hoax. And the gold. A solid gold coffin, chambers lined with gold, in a region that was crawling with prospectors who would have moved mountains for a fraction of that. If there were genuinely gold-lined tunnels under Death Valley, the idea that they would be quietly forgotten strains belief past breaking. Gold does not get forgotten in the desert. Gold gets fought over. So the honest skeptic says, this is a summer story, a piece of entertainment, built on a genre that was already old by 1947, and we should file it there and move on. And I think, if we are being rigorous, that is the most probable single explanation. I want to say that clearly because I am not here to sell you a lost race, but not everything sits comfortably on that shelf, and this is where I have to slow down and be equally fair to the other side. Because a few things about this case do not behave the way a pure fabrication usually behaves. First, there is that odd silence I mentioned, the absence of a proper debunking. When you compare this to other famous hoaxes of the era, most of them have a rich afterlife of exposure. This one mostly just faded. That does not prove a cover-up, but it is a texture that does not quite fit the tidy hoax story either. Second, and more importantly, there is the deeper layer of tradition underneath it. The tunnel motif was not invented by two prospectors in 1947. It was already there, embedded in the oral traditions of the Southwest, spoken long before any newspaper existed. Now, a skeptic will say, of course, that is exactly why the hoaxers set their story there. They borrowed a familiar backdrop, and that is a completely reasonable reading. But there is another way to read the same fact, and honesty demands we hold it too. It is possible that the newspaper story was not a pure invention, but a distortion, a sensationalized, gold-plated, giant-sized exaggeration wrapped around a much smaller and much older kernel of something real. Maybe someone did find a cave, or a burial, or a marked passage in the rock, and by the time it reached print, it had grown mummies 8 feet tall and a coffin of gold. This is the thing about the desert Southwest that we cannot ignore. It genuinely is full of caves, of old mine workings, of natural tunnels, and of real archaeological sites. People have found real human remains in that landscape, and the line between a modest true discovery and a wild published claim is exactly the kind of line that gets blurred in a sensational era. So the version that says every single detail was fiction and the version that says every detail was real are probably both wrong. The interesting territory is in between. And here we run straight into our most important principle, the one I keep coming back to. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is not evidence of presence either. The fact that no museum holds a giant mummy from Death Valley does not prove a cover-up. It is far more likely that there was simply nothing to hold. But it is equally true that a modest real find could have been made, misreported, and quietly lost without anyone conspiring to hide anything at all. Things get lost in history not because of grand secrecy, but because of ordinary neglect. A prospector who died, a notebook that burned, a site that was never relocated. We do not need a government vault to explain silence. We only need time and carelessness, which the desert supplies in abundance. So where does that leave the intrigue, sharpened rather than dulled? It leaves us with a modern story that is almost certainly exaggerated, sitting on top of an older tradition that is genuinely ancient, and a silence in the record that could mean fraud or could mean simple loss. We have not solved anything. We have only made the shape of the question clearer. And to press further, we have to look at the one element in all of this that nobody made up, the ground itself. Because here is the piece that too many retellings skip right over, the two men. Their names get passed around in the modern versions of this story, but when you actually try to run those names down, to find the men behind the claim, to find their other writings, their credentials, their fate, you hit fog almost immediately. And that fog is itself a kind of evidence, though we have to be careful about which way it points. Think about what a genuine, world-changing discovery would have done to the lives of the men who made it. 8-foot mummies and gold-lined chambers would have been the story of the century. The men who found them would have been famous, hounded, funded, disputed, celebrated, or exposed. There would have been a trail, lectures, letters, lawsuits, expeditions bearing their names. Instead, what we mostly have is a name attached to a single story that vanished. That is not the footprint of two men who really uncovered a lost civilization. It is far more consistent with the footprint of a tall tale told once and never backed up. But turn it over one more time, because the same fact carries a second reading. In that era, in that subculture of lost race and hidden civilization enthusiasts, a claim did not need to be true to circulate. It only needed to be told with confidence and to land in the right community. And communities like that had a way of repeating claims until the original source dissolved entirely. The men could be half real, their story half borrowed, and the whole thing could still take on a life larger than either. So the fog around them tells us the story is unreliable, but it does not, on its own, tell us the story is empty. Now put the two lines of this whole investigation side by side, because this is where they finally meet. On one side, the ancient layer, the indigenous traditions of a people who lived in that valley for thousands of years, whose stories, like those across the Southwest, spoke of the underground, of ancestors, of a world beneath the world. On the other side, the modern layer, a 1947 newspaper claim of tunnels and giants and gold, wild in its details, thin in its evidence, and gone almost as soon as it came. The unsettling thing is how these two layers rhyme. Strip away the 8-foot mummies and the solid gold coffin, the details that scream sensational press, and what is left underneath is the idea of passages in the earth and a people who came before. And that idea was not new in 1947. It was old. It was already in the land's memory. Which raises the possibility that the newspaper did not invent its skeleton, only its flesh. That it took a real, ancient thread of underground tradition and dressed it in the gaudy costume of a treasure story. And now bring in the physical reality of the place, the one witness that cannot lie and cannot be bribed. Death Valley genuinely does have caves. It genuinely does have old mine tunnels, some of them extensive, cut by prospectors over more than a century. It genuinely does have a documented human past stretching back thousands of years. None of that is legend. All of it is on the map and in the ground. So, the raw materials for a real underground find, a passage, a burial, an old worked-out shaft mistaken for something older, those materials actually exist there. The setting of the story is not fantasy. Only the scale of the story is in doubt. That is what makes this case so stubborn. It is not that the evidence points to a lost race. It very much does not. It is that the story sits at the exact intersection where a genuine ancient tradition, a real cave-riddled landscape, and a sensational modern press all overlap. And at that intersection, telling the true kernel from the invented shell becomes almost impossible from where we stand today. Two independent things, the old tradition and the modern claim, seem to point at the same underground idea, and we cannot fully prove that the pointing means anything at all. So let me give you the honest answer, not the legend, and not a lazy dismissal, but the version the whole weight of evidence actually supports. The 1947 Death Valley story, taken literally, is almost certainly not true. There was no race of 8-foot mummies. There was, in all likelihood, no solid gold coffin and no gold-lined tunnels. The claim carries every classic marker of the sensational lost race genre that was already flourishing in early 20th century America. And the human record, biological, archaeological, geological, simply does not support giants beneath the sand. If you want the single most probable explanation, it is this: a tall tale, born in a landscape and an era perfectly primed to grow it. But here is where the two lines finally resolve, and it is more interesting than a flat hoax. The story was almost certainly not built out of nothing. It was built out of something that was already there, the deep, real tradition of the underground that belonged to that valley long before any newspaper. The old memory and the modern headline were never truly in conflict. One was ancient and quiet, the other was modern and loud, and the loud one, in all likelihood, was a distorted gold-plated echo of the quiet one. The press did not invent the idea of passages in the earth. It found that idea waiting, and it wrapped a treasure story around it. Think back over what we have laid out. The sensational format of the source, the biologically impossible giants, the gold that no prospector would ever have forgotten, the fog around the men who supposedly found it. Each of those, on its own, points toward fabrication. Together, they leave very little room for the literal version to survive. That is the honest verdict, and I will not dress it up. And yet, I cannot tell you that nothing real ever lay underneath it, because I do not know that, and neither does anyone else. Somewhere in that desert of caves and old shafts and genuine ancient sites, some small true thing may have set the story in motion. A passage, a burial, a marked stone, something ordinary that grew in the telling into something impossible. That kernel, if it existed, is lost now, not to a conspiracy, but to the simplest thief there is: time. After everything, the wild headline, the missing photographs, the vanished men, the biologically impossible bodies, it comes down to this quiet truth. The most extraordinary thing about the Death Valley lost race is not that a giant was ever found beneath the sand. It is how effortlessly a real, ancient memory of the underground could be stolen, painted gold, blown up to 8 feet tall, and sold as a summer sensation, and then dropped and forgotten, leaving us unable to ever fully separate the true thread from the invented one. But the answer is not really where this story ends, because what it reveals about us, about how we make and lose our own history, is the part that stays. Look at what this whole tangle is really made of. 3 kinds of evidence, the 3 we always come back to. There is the written record, a newspaper story, unreliable, sensational, and gone. There is the material world, the real caves, the real tunnels, the real ancient presence in that valley, solid and on the map. And there is the oral tradition, the memory of the underground carried by the people who lived there longest, older than any paper. Each one tells a fragment. Not one of them alone closes the question. And the loudest of the 3, the newspaper, turns out to be the least trustworthy, while the quietest, the tradition, turns out to be the oldest and the deepest. That is the lesson I keep taking from stories like this one. We assume the printed word is the reliable part, and the spoken tradition is the fragile part, and it is very often the other way around. A newspaper can lie brilliantly and vanish in a week. A tradition kept alive by voice can carry a true shape of the world for thousands of years, even when the details drift. To the people of that valley, the underground was never a treasure story. It was part of how the land was understood. That deserves respect, not a gold coffin painted over the top of it. And maybe that is the real warning buried here. Not a warning about giants, but about how easily a genuine memory can be hijacked. How a loud, false story can bury a quiet, true one so completely that we can no longer tell them apart. That is the actual disappearance in this case, not 2 prospectors. An older truth, lost under the noise of a headline. Remember the coffin of solid gold we started with? The image that pulled you in. Look at it again now. It was almost certainly never real, but it was made of something real. A much older idea about what sleeps beneath that desert, dressed up in the one metal that always gets a crowd's attention. The gold was the lie. The underground was the memory. So here is what I want to ask you. Is there a story like this from where you come from? A tale everyone repeats, so loud and so shiny that no one asks anymore what quieter, older truth it might have grown out of. Tell me in the comments. I read them, and those quiet threads are exactly what this channel is for. I genuinely want to hear your answer. The comments under these videos are half the reason I keep making them. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, the stories that sit in the gap between record and memory, then subscribe, because that gap is where this whole channel lives, and there are stranger cases still to come. If it held you all the way to the end, a like really does help more people find it. That is not a small thing. It is how quiet channels like this one survive. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. Keep asking what the loud stories are covering up. I will see you in the next one.